Hello, lovelies. Welcome to the second video with my wonderful friend, Crystal. We were just talking about in the first video, I was kind of saying how having mental illness has given me a compassion and an understanding more to, I use drug addiction or, other addictions. I have a hard time judging because I understand what it feels like to want to escape and numb, and sometimes that must feel like the only option. And we were just talking about how in the families that we're placed in the, in North America, or if I didn't have a support system, we were kind of talking a little bit about how that makes a difference with our coping mechanisms and or getting help. And I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a big piece. So when we look at, we were just talking about it as like tools in our toolbox, right? So we were both born into middle-class families. We had, good attachment to our parents.
We're white.
We're white. We lived in big cities or, with resources. So all of these kind of protective factors that compounded and created space for us to have tools in our toolbox to pick maybe more high functioning ways of dealing with, or societally acceptable ways of dealing with some of our struggles. But when we look at childhood trauma and we look at adults, this is for us at Raising Wildflowers, why we become really passionate about treating childhood trauma in childhood,
right?
Because the end result is adults who are struggling with these issues and end up filling up our justice system. It becomes an issue that hurts all of us as a society. And it's so easy to see this as that person's problem. But when we look at what tools they had in their toolbox, they didn't have some of these protective factors in childhood. They had traumatic experiences. They had, they just didn't have what we had to pick coping mechanisms.
Right.
And so if we can view it in that lens, that leads us to compassion and to how do we as a society come around people and lift them up? How do we change this, the trajectory of this, which starts a long time before adulthood.
So I'm curious about more of the things that you do with Raising Wildflowers, and you talked a little bit about trauma and carrying trauma. And one of the things that I'm so fascinated about, because I know nothing about, is maybe what you have heard or experienced about carrying trauma as a parent of, someone with trauma, or of an adopted child, or
So that's absolutely a big part of my mental health journey, especially in the last few years. So we adopted two children as older children who had quite a significant amount of trauma in their lives prior to coming to us. And that sometimes I refer to that as when trauma moved into my home. So having grown up the way that I did, I did not have a whole large amount of trauma in my life. I had a lot of protective factors, and all of a sudden I was slammed into the reality of the pain and brokenness in the world in a really real, visceral way, because it moved into my house. So that was a big piece of that, and I would love to talk about that. I think some important things to talk about are post-adoption depression. So there's a lot of adoptive parents who are struggling with depression after adopting children, in the same way that parents are struggling after having a baby. And it's not talked about. It's really not even recognized yet by the medical community in a big way, but it needs to be. And I think that too also applies. In some senses, it's a form of situational depression, right? So maybe that is, your journey wasn't into this through adoption, but maybe your journey is with caring for an elderly parent that has had a health crisis, who's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, or some life-changing thing where it's completely upended your parent-child relationship and you're now the caregiver. Or maybe you are a biological parent of a special needs child that you did not expect this to be your journey, and you are now parenting a child with fairly high needs. Down syndrome, on autism spectrum, special needs parents have been some of my greatest champions and friends in this journey. So there's a lot of ways that, so, you know, I'm going to talk about this from an adoptive parent perspective, but that, or foster parent perspective, but that isn't necessarily the entry into this journey. And I just want people to hear that this might apply to you if that's not your journey into this. And then the other piece for me, so what was really wrapped up was post-adoption depression, and then very quickly what's referred to as secondary trauma or caregiver burnout. So when we talk about carrying trauma or carrying our child through their special need or their non-neurotypical journey, or our elderly parent through a really difficult, diagnosis or change in life, that becomes a really real reality. So for me, the post-adoption depression piece was a little bit easier because I'd had postpartum depression.
Right.
So it was I was able to recognize fairly quickly that this is where I was in my life again, and that maybe I needed some assistance in the form of medication again. And so that piece was not so difficult, I guess, to recognize. It was difficult to live in. So, and it's really, there's a lot of shame around that because in some senses, everything you wanted has come to pass. If that's postpartum, you've had this baby, and there are so many people that don't get to have a baby. If you are an adoptive parent, you have been waiting and prepping and, doing all these things, and the children that you hoped for, dreamed for, prayed for are finally in your home. And so the expectation of the world is you must be so happy. And that is, that's a really heavy word when you have just had your entire life maybe upended. And it's a very lonely word because the expectation from others around you is that you're going to be happy. And if you are feeling everything but happy, it can be a really lonely place. So for me, it looked a lot like, once again, I'm high functioning. So I, could deal with everything that I needed to deal with. We would get the kids into bed and I would collapse onto the kitchen floor and sob and sob and sob and sob that this was our life. And how was I going to get up the next day and do it? Actually, how was I going to get up 57 times in the night and deal with children who needed to be dealt with and still do it? At one point, I had someone say to me, your life just isn't sustainable. I had 5 children, 8 and under. My oldest was 8 and my youngest was 8 months old. And I thought, my life isn't sustainable. This is my life. Like, what more do you have to offer me? Because what do I do? These kids need to have all of their needs met. And so that just had to happen. So that was post-adoption depression. Once I got back on meds that worked for me and got that figured out, that piece kind of leveled out, but very quickly progressed into secondary trauma. So when you're faced, especially with a child in your home who, as a result of their trauma, as a result of their special needs, has very big behaviors that can be violent, that can be physical, that can be full on and in your face, and often directed at their caregiver, not by their own choice, not by their own anything, but you are the safest place. And so that's where all of that maybe gets put. It's on a cognitive level, it's very easy this is a child, I'm the grown up. Same with an elderly parent, maybe that has progressed into Alzheimer's, has become verbally abusive, or is struggling with, with being physically, violent. This is your parent, and that this is not by choice. This is not what they want to do. This is rooted in fear for them. But it doesn't change what's happening to you. And I think that's a really important piece of secondary trauma that needs to be discussed, because sometimes you'll talk with professionals who are like, well, it's a child, or it's, it's a senior citizen, and you're like, I was really triggered this year at New Year's, all over Facebook. People were posting, just let go of your toxic relationships, let go of that, set good boundaries. And for some of us, the most toxic relationships in our lives are with 7-year-olds or 80-year-olds. And they are not relationships that we can separate ourselves from, because they are our parent or our child, and they deserve to have us keep showing up, and they need for us to keep showing up, but we also need to take care of our own mental health in the midst of that. And one of my favorite sayings was from a counselor who said, you need to put on your own oxygen mask first. Because you can't help anyone else if you don't. You can't pour from an empty cup. You can't. If you aren't helping yourself, you cannot help the person that you're trying to help.
And I was thinking, it's hard, especially if you're like your child, like you were saying, maybe it's someone in your family, maybe this, that you also want to, you're less likely to talk about it because you want to protect them. You don't want them, them to be judged, or, you still want your child to be invited to other places, but then who do you talk to? And if you're, Crystal and I are very, very open. We're, struggling a little bit, about that. So I'm wondering, because I don't know a lot of medical terms, is that a part of secondary trauma, like trying to keep it secret?
I think that it very much, like you said, becomes that for people because of societal expectations. And I think sometimes too, we forget that often, because that primary caregiver, if it's a parent or you're caring for your elderly parent or whatever, that is the place where that is completely safe for the person who's struggling. And so that's where they're going to put all of their stuff. And so people have these ideas around and these judgments as an adoptive parent or people with foster children in their home. Like we talked about before, society, Hollywood does not do a good job of portraying mental illness well. And it does not do a good job of portraying foster or adopted children very well. And same thing like postpartum depression. We talked about in the last video how that is sometimes shown as the mom who, does horrible things, harms her children. And sometimes that's the only piece of foster and adoptive children that's shown is the kind of the extreme end of things. But it's important to remember that that parent is safe, that home is safe. And so that's where people will lay their worst stuff and their worst selves. And that's not, they're not going to show that to their teachers or other kids or other families.
And I didn't understand that as a teacher. I'm like, what? They're not, they're not like that at all. And I don't know if I didn't experience some of it, if I was just like, no. And I think that, I think that what you guys are doing with Raising Wildflowers is that the education piece is amazing. And, I don't have adopted children, but I am learning so much. So please go visit, read the things, because it doesn't matter. It applies to all of it. And I know, I know I've learned so much from you about that. And I really, going back to, you were talking about the justice piece and the, one step away. And I would love to talk about some of the things, because I'm not very, not that we want facts, but fact oriented. I would love for our listeners to understand a little bit more about that and the justice system and what ends up, what you know about that.
Yeah, that's a complicated one, especially for us here in Canada, because we don't really have numbers on some of these things. We were not even, the 2008 census, I believe, was the first time that we ever even tracked the amount of kids, but like across the country in Canada, that were in foster care.
Wow.
Yeah, so we don't have great statistics, but as people are studying and as we're looking at things in other countries, because it applies to us as well, Portugal is kind of at the front of changing their conversation around a choice for some people. That when you are born with a limited toolbox, so if we kind of walked that all the way forward, so I guess, so we want to go back to kind of to the Bible. I love Deuteronomy 18, where it talks about like blessing and cursing, and I've set before you a choice: choose life, choose blessing. But I think really what we're talking about is we're talking about generational and intergenerational trauma.
Right.
And here in Canada, when we look at the horrific things that have been done to our Indigenous population,
Right.
the trauma that they've endured. As we are learning more about genetics and epigenetics, we're realizing that that changes your genes.
Wow.
And that's actually being passed down through families.
Yeah.
So you start life with less of a toolbox than you
Right.
and I do as white women.
Yeah.
That, like, when we think about that alone, so you started life, then maybe what happened to you in utero. So if you are in a population here in Canada that's more prone to being exposed to violence, if, you know, so your mom was stressed her entire pregnancy,
Right.
because she is living in a situation with domestic abuse, or she doesn't know how she's going to feed your siblings every day or care for herself, you are not receiving the kind of prenatal care that you need, and you are living in this highly stressful environment. And the research is showing that infants are susceptible to that.
Wow.
So that is changing your brain as you are growing in utero.
Yeah.
Then if you look at the statistics, if you are a white middle-class woman living in a city in Canada, you have a maternal mortality rate similar to that of Ireland, which is the best in the world.
Okay.
So you have like a 1 in 44,000 chance of dying in childbirth.
Yeah.
If you're an Indigenous woman living on reserve out of a remote location, you have a maternal mortality rate similar to that of sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a huge justice issue in Canada. That is an injustice that needs to be righted. So then once again, so you're more prone to having a stressful, traumatic entry into this world, which then shapes your brain. You then are prone to food instability. Maybe your parents were part of, you know, residential schools or foster care, and you didn't learn how to be parents. And so you are now, that is affecting how you are being brought up into this world. So all of these compounding factors of intergenerational trauma that are shaping the way that your brain forms, the way that it handles stress.
Yeah.
And you just don't have the toolbox that someone else has.
Yeah.
And so how can we expect you to make different choices?
Yeah.
And it's just not popular when we look at what works. So they did a big study in the United States, and they found that dollar for dollar money that's spent on early childhood intervention in communities, so getting books to children between, you know, 0 and 4, that has more impact on their long-term functioning in society, in their academics, than the amount of money that's put into university, colleges, post-secondary institutions. And yet young children don't vote. And so that's not necessarily, or really can advocate for themselves in any way, shape, or form. Yeah. And so that's not where the money is going. And so we're not really doing justice for the most vulnerable subset of our population.
Yeah. And you and I talk a lot about, you know, where do we, I mean, we feel like there's a bit of momentum, but, you know, where do we start with removing the stigma? Where do we, it just all seems so overwhelming. And I love, and what I've learned a lot from you is, you know, starting in childhood, starting like giving children language and giving, you know, like, let's use the real words for things, right? Yes. Like, you know, it's awesome that we're starting to use depression and anxiety, whether it be we're using it correctly or incorrectly. But we, you know, I talked about forever how I didn't claim my diagnosis because bipolar is much like, who are they on TV, right? And the differences between the two, etc. But if we're giving kids these words very young, and I know I'm seeing a switch, like where they talk about zones of regulation, where they talk about educating for wholeness. You know, we didn't see that as successful before. It's like, if you're good at math and science, then you're good, because you're going to university, right? But, and we sometimes think of this as just you know, a neuroatypical issue, and if they get themselves all sorted out, then everything will be fine. But you talked about how it affects everyone. Like, this is our future generations, and I think we're going to learn more from them. And I think I feel really passionate about that. And I love on your guys' website, and some of the things you do is provide resources. And I think, you know, if I would have read a book about little girls with anxiety or, you know, OCD or other things, if you had someone to identify with, because one of our biggest things is belonging, right?
I think even in the church, we need to have a little bit of a shift. I think for a long time, this idea of original sin and that children were born inherently bad and sinful. And I just, Can I say I think that's crap? I think that's
You can-
crap.
you can
Okay,
say it.
I think it's crap.
You can say whatever you want.
Awesome. I think if we really look, children are born with inherent, they're born created in the image of God, and they're born with inherent goodness and compassion. I think children are born canaries.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
we nurture that out of them, because we say it's not okay to be not okay.
Yeah.
We don't allow them to express their feelings. We don't tell them that they're valid. We don't give them space. Our big
or let them
grown-up
sit
feelings.
in it, right? Like, I found that I didn't mean to, but I would, and I mean, you're not a bad parent. This is, you want your,
Yes.
child to be okay. So distraction.
Yes.
And that's my big thing.
Yeah.
Mine is, and I do it for myself, and I try and do it. So it's sitting in it and just trying to teach my children that, like, it's so uncomfortable and hard to watch, but I think,
or they're okay, right? Like,
yeah.
we had an incident on the weekend. One of my children who's ridden horses, taken lessons, loved the barn, loved horses. She had asked to come with me this time to go see her brother ride. I thought nothing of it. Of course, you love the barn. She hadn't been in about 6 or 8 months, and had a crippling anxiety, could not even enter the barn.
Wow.
And she's standing there shaking, and all I wanted to say was, "You've done this. Like, you've been here. You know these horses. Like, you're okay. You're okay." But she did not know she was okay in that moment, and she was not okay in that moment. And I needed to be in 2 places at once. I had another child. It's so hard to just say it's okay that you're not okay. Yeah. And to hold that for them, and to hold space for that. Yeah. And I think too, so we had another one of my children who struggles with anxiety, at a Christmas concert this year. He was just having a really brutal, terrible time. He was quite panicky. I was breathing with him. We were, from the audience, we were doing what we could to get him through it, because he didn't want to come off stage. I'm the mom that's like, don't do it. Like, you don't have to put yourself through that. Yeah. But already, even at his young age, you want to be normal and you want to participate. And so he's trying. But the beautiful thing is that the children around him were noticing and trying to help him. There was a little boy behind him that was rubbing his back. Oh. And there was a little girl, the little girl next to him kept being like, "No, mommy's right there. Like, look at mommy, she's right there." And another one of his friends picked up the fidget that he had been using the day before, that he had dropped on stage, and handed it to him because he knew it helped him. And what if we rewarded that instead of math and science? What if we rewarded our canaries who noticed and saw, because they even noticed and saw what most of the adults in the room weren't seeing. Wow. And so is there a piece of this that we actually take from our children in childhood? Instead of growing in our children in childhood. And for me lately, that's been a big piece of thought, is in my busyness and my needing to get places and my needing to meet all of these societal things around goals. We talked about business and expectations. Am I robbing my children of some of this this emotional intelligence that they were innately born with? Yeah. Wow. That's true. And then I start to think, we're heading to the teen, well, actually we're there, the teen years, and you kind of see it almost programmed out of them. And as a teacher, I see it like, starting grade 6, grade 7, right? That and I mean, it's a growing thing. They're supposed to be, self-centered. This is supposed to, that kind of thing. Like, neuroscience is showing us that they are. So in your teen years, your brain is actually completely almost dismantled and rebuilt, and that starts at your most lizard reptilian brain level, at your brain stem, just above your brain stem, and then moves up to your cognitive areas. And so that's why you see these kids that can be extremely cognitive and rational when they're calm and regulated, and then are losing their minds over something that you think is just absurd another time. Yeah, absolutely. Those are hard years. And it's hard not to, like, I'm fighting against stigma, and then I realize sometimes that I'm still in it. It's like ingrained in me, because I found myself starting to get into these conversations always, like, and I think it's a way to connect is, teenagers are so dramatic. And I'm like, I have pain from being called that. I have deep woundedness about feeling like I was too much, and not enough. And not enough. Yay. And I find that really hard. And so I start to think, like, if I know what I know, then what about if you don't know what you know?
I think that that's why again,
and what if you
so
literally
important.
can't access those tools,
Yeah.
right? In those moments. So your brain as a teenager is being dismantled, or you have a lot of trauma in your childhood, like you cannot access the tools in those moments of dysregulation, that even if you have them. And that's so hard as a parent. Like, hear us, if you're parenting that right now, like it's hard. It is so hard. And especially if you have your own stuff, it triggers your own stuff. And then it's just hard. I yesterday actually came across this article that was just brilliant. And it talked about using a jar with like a layer of glitter and water for your teens. Yeah. And so when your teen is just like losing their mind, the first thing we want to do is get rational with them, right? Like, well, what happened? And what did they say to you? And how do we fix this? But that part of their brain is turned off. It's the same with your child that's having a tantrum. Yeah. The words, you're wasting your breath. Don't use them. But so she was talking about, the psychologist was shake that glitter and show them, like, this is your brain right now. We need to both watch this, and we need to let your glitter settle. And then we can talk about what is going on, right? I know. I'm going to make one for my kids, because it gives you a way to have some space.
And they're visual for visual learners. Like, I'm a visual learner, they're a visual learner. You can tell your kid, oh, there's things going on in your brain. And one time I tried to show her all the pictures, and it's like,
and even as if we could be kind to ourselves, and when she's rational, show her all the pictures. That's great. We need to have those conversations. I'm constantly trying to help my children understand like you said, as a society, we're big into teaching our children the real words for their bodies. Yeah. But are we teaching them the real words for what they struggle with, and how to self-advocate? I have, some children with impulse control issues, and they maybe make poor decisions with friends, and then they think, oh, that person's never going to talk to me again, or it's very easy to go down that rabbit hole. And I still, as an adult, struggle going down that rabbit hole. Yeah. But I am trying desperately to then help my child and mentor my child into going back to that person and saying, I'm really sorry, I struggle with ADHD, or I struggle with impulse control issues. Yeah. And so I did something impulsively that I couldn't help, and I'm sorry that you got hurt, or I'm sorry that you didn't like it. But it wasn't a choice that I made. It was something that happened because of the way that my brain works. Yeah. And so I hope that you can forgive me and understand why that happened. Yeah. And maybe we can even, if it's a big incident, we can talk with the teacher about how to make sure it doesn't happen again. Yeah. Because everyone deserves to be safe in their bodies and in their spaces. But helping my children to have language to advocate for themselves to the people around them.
We're not always going to be there.
No, and we have to, as a society, start having these real conversations, because I think that that's the piece. If people understand that bipolar disorder too looks like you, anxiety, depression, several other things look like me. We need to remove the shame. The shame is killing us all. Yeah. As Brene Brown's amazing work has shown us. Yep. Shame is destroying us. So it needs to go.
It needs to go. And it's so hard. I find myself like a bunch of times a day, I know, like, I cognitively know that the thought or the feeling isn't true. Yes. And I get so frustrated that I think what I'd love people to understand is you think it anyway. Mm-hmm. You feel it in your body anyways. You know it's not true, but you're feeling it. It's very, very.
I was even saying to Shaylee this morning, because I was having a vulnerability hangover last night about coming here to talk with Shaylee about this today, and I'll have a really brutal one afterwards, I'm sure. But sometimes I watch these things, and I think, even I watch when I first years ago found You Women at She Loves, and I think, oh, I could never they'd be friends with them, or they wouldn't accept me. Like, they're my people, and I'm so glad they're out there, because I know that other people like me exist. But like, they're so polished and they're so great, and they, my mess doesn't fit into that. And thankfully God has had other plans to show me that it does, so that's great. But I think that needs to be talked about too. Like, we maybe look really nice, we put on nice shirts and lipstick, and they're sitting here. Yeah. But that doesn't mean, like, you can kind of see my rash right now, my anxiety rash. It's okay. Yeah. No, it's okay. Yeah. But just know that if you, that it doesn't always look like this. No. But too. Yeah. It's important.
Yeah. And I think that, a little bit, like, I share ridiculous things on Instagram, and things I wouldn't want to be seeing, like how I look. And I'm finding it really empowering to just, just be like that, because, and also like the things I do with decorating and all of that, right? You make fun of a Pinterest mom. I like that, I don't do it to the death. I like that. Yeah. But a part of me wants to be like, can I show you the whole other mess?
Like
this
behind the camera.
Yeah, and just so if you're watching this and just thinking, well, you know, that's good for you.
We won't talk about how long it took us to make sure that this was straight.
Yeah, and when people just want to borrow books and take them out. Of these, I have this, like, it took me a long time to stage my my thing and borrowing books. I remember my mom just started taking them and I was like, right? Yeah, it's just sometimes what you need to do. But I love that you brought that up, and I just, that's why we're here. We want you to know you're not alone. And I just thank you so much today. You talk about the vulnerability hangover, and I think that you know, we're friends and we look comfortable and we're on a couch, but this is actually hard for us. You know, yes, I do it every month. I'm talking about these things, but it's still hard, and you have self-doubt and all the time. And I just so appreciate everyone that even says yes to me. It just means so much, and I just wanted to
I appreciate that platform, friend, because you're extraordinarily brave and starting a conversation and continuing and carrying a conversation that's so important. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Well, we are going to go drink lattes and have vulnerability hangovers together. So thank you so much for watching. Feel free to comment and share us messages. We would just love to keep this conversation going and to hear from you. So no, you're not alone. Thank you, friends.